Hello? There we are. Hi everybody and welcome to the FinTech Festival. I see many familiar faces from around the region and further beyond. Welcome and thank you very much for coming to our session at the regulation stage. I suspect a lot of regulators in the room today, so all kindred spirits. We're here to share a little bit about the IOSCO work on the FinTech Task Force. Very happy that this panel is back again for the third year. We're like a mini-series which, Netflix keeps rebooting, so yay for us. So I have here with me today Matthew Long, who's Director of Payments and Digital Assets from the UK FCA. Marian Angerek, which works with me in the MAS. She's Director and Head of Capital Markets Policy Division. And Valerie Sispanik, Director of FinHub of the US SEC. Just before we start, just want to say everybody's views here are their own and does not represent that of their organization. Just a brief background of IOSCO for maybe the few regulators, non-regulators in the crowd. It's the International Organization of Securities Commissions, and we are an organization that regulates the world's securities and futures market. The FTF, FinTech Task Force, is a board-level task force that was established in March 2022. And we were asked to develop and oversee and implement IOSCO's regulatory agenda in respect to fintech and crypto assets, and to coordinate with other regulatory bodies like the FSB and other standard-setting bodies. So FTF mainly has a policy mandate, and that's the work that we've been doing for the past 2 years. So in the first 2 years, the FTF actually focused very much on crypto and digital assets. Of course, the last 18 to 24 months, the crypto space was very hot, and we had, by the end of 2023, put out 2 sets of recommendations, one on crypto and digital assets. There were 18 recommendations, and also some guidance on DeFi. So with the publication of these 2 big, broad, and ongoing topics, the FTF then went on to the next program of work to support IOSCO members in the implementation of monitoring of the recommendations that were put out. And then we decided that we had to also look at new technologies that were coming on board. No surprise, we turned our eyes to AI. So we formed the AI work group that is led by Valerie. The implementation work group that I talked about earlier is led by Matthew. And we also started a work stream on tokenization of digital assets led by Marian. So today we're going to get them to share a little bit of the work, a little bit forward looking. As mentioned, I guess a continuation of a piece of work that we've been doing the last 2 years and the recommendations that came out. We are now in the next phase of basically trying to roll it out and help jurisdictions figure out how best to do this. FCA led the policy work for this, and now they are leading the implementation work group. Maybe you want to give us a little bit of idea of how we're going about this and how the steps we're taking to look at this, Matthew.
Okay, thank you, Abigail, and it's great back to be on this stage for the 3rd year running, and what's also great is I can come back and give you some delivery and some results. So if we just go back those 2 years and remember what we were trying to do, what we were trying to do is globally get some outcomes for crypto regulation. We accept that there's differences around the world in terms of how we're regulating, but that report was very much about creating recommendations that say we've got the same risk, we've got the same activities, so we want this, the same outcome. Okay. So in terms of that, what we did is we did the roundtables with you here and then all around the world, both in terms of industry and regulators, and came up with those recommendations. There were 18 recommendations, and they break down into the 6 areas. So those 6 areas are conflicts of interest, retail distribution, custody and client assets, operational and technical risks, market abuse, and cross-border cooperation. Now, what's been really important to us and has flowed through this work is that cross-border cooperation, and that's why it's really important to be here today. Now, in terms of cross-border cooperation, that's not just about regulators. That's about industry. So it's about how industry work together in the crypto market, and it's also about how regulators work together and how those two come together. But of course, if you create 18 recommendations, what you want to do is say, how are we doing with them? How are we regulators taking them forward? So the next piece of the work was to ask every country in the IOSCO family, which is almost 140 countries, about how are you implementing those things. So first part was the survey, which is how are you doing, but then the second part was what are you going to do next. So that's what we've done, that's where we've got to, and we've just concluded that piece of work, Abigail. So I'm really excited now to actually work through and describe that work going forward.
I know we went around and tried to figure out what different jurisdictions are doing. I mean, in this space of crypto assets, when we first started out, everybody was grappling with figuring out the technology and the regulatory impediments or the regulatory concerns. And I think we've reached some sort of measure of convergence, and I think the recommendations really help coalesce that for many jurisdictions around the world. And for implementation, I know you went out and did a little bit of a landscape survey. Maybe if you could share a little bit of what the key findings were for that and what you think is going to be top of mind for regulators around the world.
Right, so the first thing that I think is really important about the finding is that in a really comprehensive response, we got a great response globally, is that the majority of countries globally are implementing the the recommendations. So that's really important, so that's good news. So we're coming together to actually implement those recommendations. However, and many of you will catch me over the next couple of days explaining to me the difference in your jurisdiction. What we did see is that there is a real variance in terms of how that's being dealt with. So in some countries, of course, you've got an existing regime, and in other countries, we're developing a regime. And so one of the questions I often get is, when will we have equivalence? Well, in order to get anywhere near equivalence, you've actually got to have regimes that can be equivalent and can talk to each other. So one of the findings was, we're implementing. Another finding was that there is difference. But then there were some really key themes that came out from the regulators, which were about the market. So one of the themes was about how you work as industry, if you are industry, about how you share information, and there's work to be done. And there's also about how we work as regulators and then make sure that we're one team, how we share information, etc. But specifically, market abuse, fraud, and market manipulation are issues that are coming out. So what we're now doing, which is the next phase, is to actually say, okay, so we've got the global position, we've got where we are with the recommendations, we're now doing jurisdictional deep dives. What does that mean? What that means is we're going to look at each very specific countries and say, okay, how are you doing on these particular areas? Probably working with other standard setting bodies, and actually say, okay, what are we learning about what's going well here, but also what are the areas that we can develop, which leads us on to capacity building. What we're going to do as a team is help each other where we've got good practice and good examples to build that regulation in different countries. And that's why it's important that IOSCO exist and that we can sort of use that information to build better regimes. So in summary, next steps is more information, and then we'll probably move on to full assessments. Why does that matter? That matters because we need to get the right outcomes for crypto, and we need to have a global solution to the way we deal with crypto.
I think Singaporeans in the crowd won't be unfamiliar with assessments. I guess in the end of the day, we will have to do that at some point, but not that soon. We'll have the capacity build, as you said. I mean, that's an important part.
Yeah, and one of the things that came out of the survey, which makes sense to lots of us in the room, is that if you've already got a regime and and that's in place, that's great, and you're responding and learning with that. But if you're building a regime, the majority of regimes realistically take a few years to build, right?
That's right.
So what we've got to make sure is we don't start jumping into all of the detail right now. What we're trying to do is actually build those regimes together. We've had to, over the last 3 days, we've really been looking at each of the issues, seeing how we can work together. Had lots of industry roundtables and discussions about, okay, how can we do this particular bit better? There was a really good one yesterday on market abuse, where we were looking about the methods by which we can have global market abuse monitoring, as well as how we have national and then, if you want to, regional.
I agree with you, Matthew. I think it's all a question of getting started, putting out a roadmap, and I think that's what the IOSCO Task Force is helping to do, that, to put out the key planks of it, so that at least jurisdictions can figure out, what the next steps are and what the key concerns are. I also really like the one you said, right? It's amazing how the conversation has gone from basically trying to reduce regulatory arbitrage to now conversations turning to equivalence. I think that shows really the maturity of where we've come with regulation in this space. So that's kind of like strange to say that 2 years on that crypto assets kind of like regulation and what you're thinking about is mature and more mainstream. I mean, it was just impossible to think about it in that terms maybe 2 years ago when we were here. It was all new and unfamiliar. And now today we have something else new and unfamiliar which we're all grappling with, or regulators need to really get our hands and put our arms around well, because there are going to be regulatory concerns, there will be market abuse, there will be consumer protection issues as well. So I'm obviously referring to one of the biggest buzzwords in finance now, which is artificial intelligence. And I'll turn to you, Valerie. Can you share with us a little bit of background why the FinTech Task Force in our deliberations last year decided that, yeah, look, this is an area we really have to look at and look at now?
Thanks, Abby. And first of all, it's great to be back here in Singapore at the Singapore FinTech Fest. All that's going on, it's great to see the excitement around innovation is continuing. And speaking of excitement, there's a lot of excitement around the topic of artificial intelligence. Again, this is technologies that have been around for decades and people have been using them kind of in the background. But I think with ChatGPT, AI kind of took a quantum leap in terms of the types of models that are out there, the technologies, generative AI, these more advanced systems that are in place are becoming more accessible to the everyday user, and they're becoming integrated into all kinds of facets of our everyday life. And so just as people are excited about it, financial firms are excited about thinking of how they can integrate these technologies into financial products and services to increase productivity or to create more interactive interfaces with their clients or to increase access to investment opportunities. So it is the right time for IOSCO to kind of take a look and try to figure out what's going on and come to a shared understanding of what these new technologies are, what the developments are, and think about any kind of risks and challenges that these might present going forward. So we're looking at these things and the developments through the eyes of the investor protection, market integrity, and systemic risk that we always kind of look at with IOSCO to make sure that we're keeping track. The first phase of this work will be more of a stock take. So we've engaged stakeholders from all over the world in roundtables, a series of roundtables that were held. We sent out a series of surveys to FTF members, so these are regulators from around the world. We have surveyed some of the self-regulatory organizations and some of the members of the financial markets who are thinking about integrating new technologies into their products and services. So right now, our report is really covering a stock take or a diagnostic of what's going on and thinking about some of the risks that we should be thinking about as regulators going forward.
Yeah,
kind of an overview.
Val. I must say that the work that we've done in the task force the last year, we've really reached out across to industry, fellow regulators, different types of demographics or firms, really trying to get a better understanding of how AI is used. I mean, in our experience, we started doing things like machine learning, which at that time was new, but now looking back, it's actually quite basic, and people were already saying that, okay, machine learning can help you with your business process improvements, right, within your organizations, leverage it. It wasn't really much used in terms of a client-facing capacity, but I think with Gen AI, and it's kind of like a J-hook, how AI development has taken off. And I think as Val said, right, that's when regulators really sat up and we said, okay, with Gen AI, we get a sense that there's going to be great possibilities of FIs or financial institutions or the capital markets using this. And we think the way it's going, because it's so easy to use, I mean, anybody can start talking to ChatGPT and it's lots of fun. I've been using it to write poems. I do not have a poem today for you, maybe next year. But because of that, it was quite clear it's got great retail reach, right, as compared to machine learning. And I think that kind of like gets all of us a little bit worried. But there are, of course, risks and opportunities like fire, right? It can be used for good. It can also have harm, and that's kind of like where we're trying to control it. So Val, in your stock take and your engagements, I'm sure you've collected many use cases or things people are using Gen AI or AI for. Do you have any you want to share with us today, as in what makes you hopeful or what really scares you?
Sure, I'll give you guys a sneak peek. So we found that IOSCO wrote a report in 2021, which did kind of a stock take and also explained some of the risks at the time as with these more traditional types of AI, which basically people were using who are data scientists and computer scientists, and these are very kind of determinative systems where a given input yields an output that people kind of expect and can predict. Gen AI takes it to another level because this is a synthesis of new material based on data over which the AI tool has learned information, and so it is a little bit unpredictable. And for the reason that it is creative, it's also not deterministic. So it has some bit of an uncertainty around the outputs that can come out. And I think when you're looking at that, there are some really use cases that are interesting that bubble to the surface. So I think what we're seeing is financial products and services firms are trying to figure out how they can harness this new technology, but not risk their reputation, their clients, or their firms. And so they're looking at these technologies to say, how can we increase efficiencies within our organizations around summarizing documents or code synthesis or information management, those kinds of things, or internal chatbots. So we see a lot of experimentation going into those products. We see a little bit more caution, and rightfully so, around putting these products into a consumer or an investor application, because they are evolving and in some ways untested. And so we have to worry about things like, will they hallucinate? Will they make up answers that aren't correct? They're just contextually relevant, but they're not really correct. Do people understand what these technologies are capable of on the one hand and what they're not capable of on the other? What are good use cases for them? What are not so good use cases for them? And so there's an evolution going on, and I think there's also a push toward how do we use these systems and technologies to automate processes. And there's, we're looking at where does the human need to be in the loop, or maybe looking at things about AI as augmented intelligence. It's really still the human that has responsibility for what the human is deciding to do with technology, but using technology to augment the human decision. So I think there's a lot of caution around new technologies. We're finding that good practices are starting to form in terms of how do you evaluate these technologies for use case? How do you take something from the ideation stage all the way to a production stage and then to monitoring stage? And we're finding that some of the big firms are taking processes they had in place around governance and controls for technology, and in many cases augmenting those to look at the new risks presented by generative AI. And that has to do with data quality. It has to do with what can you expect these systems to do, how resilient they are in times of stress, for example, how explainable they are. In many cases, these kind of black box based systems aren't explainable. So how does one look at that when you're providing financial products and services and thinking about your obligations under whatever regime you're in? And so these are really interesting questions, and I think we're focusing on risks from a micro level all the way to a macro level. So we're looking at what are the risks to a consumer or an investor or a particular firm that may be inherent in these technologies or the way that they're used, and then looking all the way at the other side. So if these technologies are being used at a broad scale in certain applications, are they creating a buildup of risk in the markets that we need to think about? And so those are the kind of issues we're exploring in this first phase of the work.
Thanks, Val. I think for me as a regulator, disclosure is one of the big things, right, as capital market regulators. And so for me, the biggest thing that I'm struggling with is the explainability, because if you can't even explain it, how are you going to disclose it? So I think that's something we really, will have to dig deeper into. So that for me is a top key one. I don't know about you, Matthew. What's the top key AI worry that,
It's always nice to get a question you weren't expecting.
You can handle it.
So I think one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of AI is, and particularly the firms that I'm working with, is where you've got things like LLM,
large language models.
You know, it's about how far you go, how close are you getting to a regulatory advice and that type of stuff. So I think it's quite important that we're looking at how we're using them. But one of the key elements for me as well is the outcomes. So in black box, where you're saying, okay, this, you've got two options and it's right 99% of the time. Well, on that 1%, how are you mitigating it? How are you looking at that? And ultimately, what is the outcome there? So that's what we're looking at. I mean, I've been really impressed with some of the firms and what they've been doing. But I think one of the things is when we get to your point, it's the augmentation. It's about the human that is in, the human is the person that's responsible, right? And we can't get away from it being something that's on the other side.
That's right, yeah.
And I think we are also focusing, obviously, on the malicious uses of AI. So AI can be a force multiplier for bad actors who can now, off the shelf, purchase AI tools to enable bad activity. So that is something that we're very concerned about as regulators, keeping our eye on and making sure that there's education at least out there, and then possible mitigating impacts.
Yeah, that reminds me, I think IOSCO recently had World Investor Week. It's a kind of like a week where we push out investor education in October. And one of the sessions that was run was about AI, you know, how AI can be used for scams. And it's really scary because, I mean, humans doing scams at scale is already scary, but enabled by AI with deep fakes. And apparently, you know, scam emails used to be easy to spot because they had typos all over the place. Apparently now with AI, the AI vets it beautifully. And so, you know, I think we're going to have to kind of like catch up with the malicious angle of it. Thanks very much for that impromptu discussion, because I do see a lot of familiar regulator faces in the crowd from my regional friends, so I thought it would be good to have a little chit-chat about that. Now, turning to the other third big work stream at IOSCO is on tokenization. And I think anybody who's kind of like had a little swing around the FinTech Festival will see tokenization is the next big thing. And tokenization here is different, you know, from crypto, because we're talking about tokenization using the blockchain and the technology, but generally for capital markets products, right? So basically your usual bonds, securities, how do you then turn it into a digital mode? And for distribution, for issuance, what does that even mean? And of course, as regulators, we're all beady-eyed and looking at, okay, is this still the same risk, same regulation, same outcome? And how are we going to do that moving forward? So Marian leads this work group in the FTF. Want to share a little bit more about what we're looking at there?
Thanks, Abigail. Hi, everyone. So financial asset tokenization is one of the important area of focus for the IOSCO FinTech Task Force. We observe the increasing growing interest among the capital markets participants. This is also evidence from the increasing number of experimentations as well as use cases across the globe over the past few years. So in early this year, in March 2024, the task force set up a new working group to look into the current state of developments in financial asset tokenizations, and also to look at the adoptions of DLT in the capital market space, and more importantly, to identify potential new areas of risk as well as the novel issues that may come up from this development that may have implications in the market integrity as well as investor protections. So as part of the ongoing work, IOSCO had done quite a number of industry outreach, including bilateral engagement, to kind of understand the current experimentations that's going on in the industry, and to understand some of the challenges that industry are facing as well. And you know, from all this development, we also had conducted stock take, you know, kind of do a survey with the IOSCO task force members to get an early insights in terms of the initial policy thinking on the regulations on asset tokenizations. And based on all these informations that we have gathered, we noted that essentially asset tokenization is still quite nascent at this moment in time. And based on that assessment, we will look into what are the possible scenarios or circumstances from this development that could evolve, that we need to look further into the regulations as well as additional policy guidance to supplement whatever that has been published from the IOSCO principle as well as the CDA and DeFi report that we published last year. So this is an interesting area to watch. We noted that as things developed, there would be potentially new areas of risk or concern, vulnerabilities. May not be a new areas of risk, but more existing risk that can manifest in a new in a new way that could then potentially create or introduce new vulnerabilities. So, for example, in the technology or cyber risk, we noted that the security practices for smart contracts, they are still evolving, and this would introduce new vulnerabilities to the system. And likewise for the legal risk that we have noted, depending on how the tokens is being created in terms of token ownerships, it is still something that needs to be understood clearly, depending on the type of tokens, the models of the tokens, whether it is native tokens or non-native tokens, and how it may interact with the underlying assets that it represents. So these are ongoing work that we will be looking at, and the work will continue in 2025. We will continue to also coordinate with the FSB and other standard setting bodies to understand the policy considerations as well as the thinking, and more importantly to work with the industry and market participants as this space develops.
Yeah. Thanks, Marion. I think what you say is really interesting in that because it's actually capital markets products, right? So in terms of regulatory remit, it's different from cryptocurrencies. You know, cryptocurrencies, the regulatory remit is really quite wide-ranging across jurisdictions. We've all kind of like tried to cut the pie a little bit differently, mainly because of where our starting points are or what our regulatory regimes were like. But you know, at the end of the day, we still can get to the similar outcomes. Like for example, the IOSCO recommendations basically apply no matter how you actually classify the cryptocurrency. I guess in tokenization, that's not the biggest hurdle. For me, I think tokenization, the biggest hurdle is trying to say that, okay, you're a capital markets product, you're securities, and then my rules then generally would apply to you. And one area I think we've worked on domestically is on what does segregation of assets mean, right? So in normal TradFi world, segregation means your assets is in a trust account, or you know the securities are held in a depository agent, and that's quite clear. But what does it mean in tokenized world? And I think that's where we're going to have to examine what are the risks, what kind of guidance that we can give a little bit more, right? So it's same, but not quite. So I think that's kind of like where we see is where tokenization is kind of like going, right, in the way we're thinking about it. I think, so I mean, IOSCO is really doing all this cutting edge work, and we've just been learning a lot about technology and then trying to figure out how to reach our same regulatory outcomes. I think regulatory outcomes like consumer protection, market integrity, financial stability, this is going to be evergreen. But I think one thing I've learned working past 3 years with IOSCO is that the way that we achieve those outcomes is so different. We got to think about new ways, new creative ways, new tools. But the top thing I think is international regulatory cooperation, which I think all of you have in a way mentioned. I mean, okay, doing a little bit of crystal ball gazing, which is not what regulators usually do, but maybe 5 years out in each of your areas, right? For crypto, tokenization, and AI, what do you think will be, what will be the regulatory landscape like, or what would you hope it to be?
Great. Well, so from the crypto perspective, what I'd like to see is those recommendations implemented globally, and we can tick against the 18 across globally. But then also what we will have seen from industry is you coming together, helping to deal with those market manipulation issues. So we've got the regulators working together, and we've got industry taking responsibility for those 18 recommendations as well. So it's one team for a great market.
I like that. I can get behind that. Val, AI. It's a bit more difficult.
So AI is not a monolith. It refers to many different technologies, and I think the risk profile of AI in any particular use case really depends on the use case, who's using it, how it's being used, and what types of technology are being used, how material is it to the decision that's being made, how much autonomy is being given to the technology. And so it's a very complicated picture. And in many jurisdictions, a lot of this is already covered by various regulations. It also is kind of a general purpose technology. So there's a lot at stake and a lot of stakeholders. So I think we want to cover the risks that are the biggest to investors in the markets, but we're going to have to really get granular.
And it's not just financial regulators, right? As you said, it's really almost kind of horizontal in the whole economy.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it could be health impacting, it could be safety impacting. These technologies are very, general purpose. So I think as market regulators, we really have to focus on and what's our lane. Yeah.
Thanks, Phil. And tokenization, Marion.
So likewise, I think in asset tokenizations and the adoptions of DLT in this space, there are lots of potential. And as an industry, as regulators, we would like to support responsible innovation in this space, and at the same time to preserve market integrity and investor protections. So to do this effectively, I suppose we all are quite familiar. We need to have global coordinations and collaborations among the legal as well as regulatory community, because we know that the tokenized world is going to be a borderless one. So this is important to have a joint understanding in terms of what is going to be the regulations and the policy going forward.
I really like it that we are ending on a high here. It's rare that you get regulators all being really positive about everything, but maybe the FinTech Festival does that to you. So just to sum up, I think we will get there. I think quite well, and the world will be a better place, and we'll work hand in hand. AI, I think, will have to work beyond the financial industry, but I think everybody's quite on it, and I have great hopes that the technology will be deployed for good. And for tokenization, I think, as Marion said, it's something that I see a space where regulators are working really closely with the industry as never before, and I think that's a great trajectory to follow. So on that uplifting note, please join me in thanking my panelists today.